The bell had already faded, yet the classroom remained, strangely awake. Wooden chairs stood in neat rows, desks wiped clean, the clock louder than it had any right to be. Somewhere down the corridor, footsteps echoed and then disappeared. If you grew up in Britain during the 70s, you remember that feeling. Not panic, not dread, just the sense that time had suddenly slowed, thickened, settled around you. This was the room no one wanted to enter, and yet almost everyone did. Decades later, many still remember it clearly, which raises a curious question. Why did this room linger long? To understand that room, we have to step back into school life in 1970s Britain. This was a time shaped by routine, structure, and an unspoken belief that order mattered. Schools were often large, formal places with long corridors, assembly halls that smelled faintly of polish, and classrooms where the day ran to a steady rhythm. Expectations were clear, even when they were never written down. You lined up properly, you addressed adults correctly, and you learned quickly where the boundaries lay. Detention, in that world, was not dramatic or unusual. It sat quietly alongside timetables, uniforms, and homework diaries, accepted as part of how school worked. It was seen less as a punishment and more as a correction, a pause designed to remind you of the rules everyone shared. Compared with today's classrooms, full of discussion and flexibility, the 70s school day feels almost restrained. Yet for many children, that structure offered certainty. And it was within that certainty that the detention room took on its particular meaning. It is this everyday setting, so familiar and so controlled. That helps explain why one small room could feel so significant once the door quietly closed at the end of school. What stayed with most people was not the reason they were there, but the room itself. The floors were scuffed by years of shoes, dull rather than shiny, telling their own quiet story. Tall windows let in a pale afternoon light that never quite warmed the space, especially in winter. A clock hung high on the wall, its ticking suddenly impossible to ignore, each second sounding heavier than the last. The furniture was plain and practical. Hard chairs, straight-backed, spaced just far enough apart to discourage any sideways glance, explore the faint ghosts of chalk, dust, and cleaning spray, carrying that familiar mix of classroom smells that instantly signaled seriousness. Even the lighting felt deliberate, bright but flat, leaving nowhere to hide. And then there was the silence. Not accidental, but carefully maintained, wrapping itself around you. For many, simply sitting there burned the room into memory. Decades later, that quiet space still returns uninvited. Proof of how ordinary places can leave extraordinary impressions long after childhood ends entirely. There were rules in the detention room, though few were ever spoken aloud. You sat upright, feet flat on the floor, hands still. Eyes stayed down, fixed on the desk or the page in front of you. Whispering was unthinkable. Even turning your head felt like breaking an invisible line. Time moved differently there, stretching and slowing, marked only by the clock's steady pulse on the wall. The work itself was rarely challenging. Lines to copy, pages to complete, simple tasks repeated again and again. The point was not difficulty, but reflection, a quiet space to think about choices made earlier in the day. No speeches, no raised voices, just stillness doing its work. Today, school discipline often comes wrapped in conversation and support, with time set aside to talk things through. Back then, the silence was the message, and within that silence, many learned lessons that lingered far longer than the exercise book left behind on the desk. Those quiet minutes shaped behavior in ways few adults ever explained. Being kept behind after school carried a weight that went beyond losing free time. There was the awkward walk back into a room you hoped never to see, the knowledge that others were already on their way home. You felt noticed, marked out, even if no one said a word. Authority was suddenly very real, not loud or angry, just calmly present. Yet boredom quickly gave way to something else. Sitting there with nothing but time and your own thoughts, many became quietly aware of themselves. What rule had been crossed, how it looked from the other side, where the line truly was. Detention wasn't about humiliation. It was about boundaries. This is something often forgotten today. That quiet system shaped behavior precisely because it asked you to think, not react. Many still remember those afternoons clearly, even now, and perhaps that lingering memory explains why the detention room earned its reputation without ever needing drama at all back then. What those rooms really taught was rarely written on the board. They reflected wider values woven through British life at the time: patience, conformity, and respect for structure. Sitting quietly, waiting out the clock, you learned to endure small discomforts without complaint. At the time, it felt enormous, almost unfair, the longest hour imaginable. Looking back now, many smile at how large those moments once loomed. The detention room was not about breaking spirits, but shaping them. It nudged children toward self-control, toward understanding that actions had consequences, even when no one raised their voice. In later years, those lessons surfaced unexpectedly, in workplaces, queues, everyday frustrations. What remained strongest is the shared memory. So many experienced it, yet rarely spoke about it. That common silence binds a generation together, reminding us how ordinary experiences can quietly influence who we become, long after the school gates closed behind us forever. Today, schools feel faster, louder, and far more open than they once did. Authority is discussed, questioned, explained. It suits a different age, yet it is hard to imagine that quiet room existing in quite the same way now. The detention room belongs to another Britain, neither harsh nor heroic, just ordinary. It fades into memory as a symbol of its time, not something to praise or condemn, but simply to remember and quietly carry with us today and tomorrow. For more of these unbelievable memories, tap the video on your screen. The 1970s stories are something else. Don't forget to subscribe.